The MCAT CARS podcast, session number 46. The CARS section of the MCAT gives thousands of pre-meds nightmares every night. Whether you're an ESL student, lack confidence while reading, or a slow reader like me, Jack Weston and the medical school headquarters are here to help you score higher in every section so you can be confident you're ready to get the MCAT score of your dreams. Welcome to the MCAT CARS podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me and Jack Weston today to help you on your MCAT journey. If you are getting almost done with the MCATs, you're getting ready to take it, to crush it because of this podcast, I want you to go check out the pre-med years, which will help you with everything else that it's going to take to get into medical school. Your applications, your personal statement, your interview prep, everything that you're going to need. Again, that's pre-med years at premedyears.com. Today, we have a great episode talking about some Civil War history. Jack Weston back for some more MCAT CARS podcast. How you doing today?
I'm great. How's it going, Ryan?
I'm excited to jump back into some cars. Whenever I don't get to talk to you, I get a little sad, but I get messages all the time from students about the podcast and how it's helping them. And then when I get to talk to you, I'm happy again.
I really can say the same.
So what do we have in store for us today?
Today's passage is, I would say, on the interesting side. It's a sensitive topic, but I think it's a very good, informative kind of discussion on history. And a lot of students normally don't like history passages because I said this before on the podcast, but because it's so hard to find the author's points of views, like what is the author trying to say about the history. So this passage is not going to be that bad in terms of the reading. The structure is very straightforward. Usually harder passages have this weird way of bringing up something and then not bringing it up until again, like later, and you just don't know how it's all connected. So I don't think that's going to be a problem for today. The problem that students may face with today's article is understanding what the author is trying to say after mentioning something. So the author will say something, but it's not going to be clear until later on what the author really wants to explain or kind of convey. So that's going to happen often. Like, I'll give you an example. Let's say I said the MCAT is hard, right? You never know what that exactly means. That could mean like a conceptual difficulty with the MCAT. That could also mean maybe a visual impairment, right? Where it's hard to read the MCAT test, on the computer. So just because the author says the MCAT is hard doesn't necessarily mean you know exactly what it's talking about. So we'll see how the context really matters when we go through this passage.
All right. Well, let's see. If you want to follow along in the show notes. We'll have a link to the article here. Paragraph 1. Conservatives sometimes accuse the academic left of ignoring the good in U.S. history and emphasizing the horrors. All right. So right off the bat, we get a history lesson potentially with the right versus the left, it seems like, right off the bat. So conservatives, right, what we consider the right typically. So this might be hard for someone who isn't necessarily hasn't been in the country very long, taking the MCAT. It's like, what's a conservative and academic left? Yeah. What does that mean? So the right and left and conservative and liberal might throw people off right away. But so right off the bat, right, conservatives accusing, right, a bad thing, the academic left, so more of the liberal people, of ignoring the good and only looking at the bad.
Okay. So you bring up a great point. What are the common kind of characteristics of America should students know when they go into these passages, right? Because I get a lot of ESL students or just students who are not necessarily history buffs or just know a lot about history that ask me, hey, what if I don't know this or that? I don't have that much outside knowledge on this or that. Do I have a problem? And this actually, I was discussing this with a student in my last free trial session. And I think there's a very big thing that you should know, right? You should know the general history of America. So you should know the Revolution. You should know when that happened. So keep a date in mind for the Revolution. So 1776 is what most people think of when they think of the Revolution. You should also know the Civil War. It doesn't hurt to know what Reconstruction is, which is right after the Civil War. So I believe it's like 1861, 64, 65. So 1860s, you should think Civil War. After that, I would say you should know a little bit about World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, and the Cold War. I think those are basic things that the MCAT does ask about or just present passages on. Not that you need to know a lot, but you should know that, the American Revolution was between, England and America, right? You should know kind of what was involved in World War I and World War II. I'm not asking you to go in and start writing a paper on this stuff. I'm just asking you to go on YouTube or go on Google and just figure out the basics of these wars, because these wars, these kind of moments really kind of impacted America today. And I think, most of these articles are going to be based on America because this is an American test. So the MCAT is, actually from Washington, D.C. That's where they actually create the MCAT. And the organization that runs it is from the capital of the United States. So it does help to kind of know some history on America, on the United States. Now, in terms of conservative or liberal, you should know basic stuff on that. So again, you can use anything to learn this, but this is basic politics of America. They do not ask questions about the political nature of Britain, right, or of another country. They don't really ask those kinds of questions. Like they're not going to ask you, they're not going to bring up prime minister so and so, but they could. But they're not going to expect you to know all the little details on that. No, they don't really expect you to know all the details on how America is structured either. But again, because the passages are so Americanized, right? I would say it doesn't hurt to have some kind of background knowledge on this. It will make you less intimidated by the topic, by the discussion. You will probably be more interested in what you're reading if you have some idea of what's going on. That's why I tell students, look, if you have trouble with certain types of passages, let's say they're political, let's say they're religious, whatever they are, do some more of them, because you'll start getting acclimated to what they're discussing and the topics and the nature of it. So it doesn't hurt to kind of know a little bit about America. All right. So yeah. All right, go ahead. Let's keep reading. So just to recap, you should know this is talking about how conservatives accuse these left-wing kind of liberal people of emphasizing the horrors, right? The problems with America. All right, go ahead.
All right. But in some respects, the typical telling of the American story does not focus enough on the horrors. Ooh, a little twist here. So this next sentence kind of says, hey, maybe we don't talk about the negative stuff enough.
Yeah. So you would think that, the author is probably going to say this is bad, right? Like we shouldn't be talking about horrors. But as you pointed, this is a twist. The author really wants to talk more about the horrors, right? Thinks that maybe the horrors should be more addressed in some way. Good. Okay. So what's the big picture of this paragraph?
That's a little bit of left versus right. So the academic left, or academia in general, talks too much about the horrors or talks a lot about the horrors, ignoring the good. But the author thinks that maybe we need to talk more about the horrors.
Yeah. So off the bat, maybe the author is kind of liberal, but we don't know, right?
Yep.
We can't make any kind of assumption here unless they say it. But yes, great point. Go ahead.
All right. Next paragraph. As I recall from my distant youth, U.S. history text dealt with the run-up to the Civil War, then the war itself, then the failure of Reconstruction, before moving on to the Gilded Age and progressive reform. All right, so the author is kind of recalling his youth and what he read in U.S. history textbooks about everything that happened in the Civil War and after.
Yeah, so this is U.S. history, right?
Yep.
The Civil War, Reconstruction, etc. It does say the failure of the Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that you can kind of understand and educate yourself on as you're reading this passage. You don't need to know anything about Reconstruction, whether it's a success or a failure. The author sees it as a failure. Go ahead.
But the failure of Reconstruction was not just a disembodied fact, but also a planned and ruthless act of sabotage. All right, now we're getting into the drama. So the failure of Reconstruction now is the author is saying that this was deliberate, it was sabotage.
Yeah, and what does that mean? Wait, a period in time was a sabotage? We don't have the context right now, right? This is what I was talking about earlier. Like, we'll say something, but we don't know exactly what it's trying to say. We don't know exactly the direction the author's headed in on this conversation. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep track of it. We should still keep track of it and try to understand where this is headed with this whole sabotage argument. Go ahead.
As Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s new book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow, effectively reminds us, the period of history following the Civil War involved a violent campaign to reverse the social, political, and economic outcomes of the conflict. All right, so we're introduced to a name. I always try to remember these names, author of this book, and it looks like the general kind of sentiment here is that the author is saying, hey, there was a lot of push to reverse the outcome of the war and what it was trying to accomplish.
Right. You don't necessarily need to know the exact outcome of the war or why they went to war. I mean, if you took any history class in high school, you would know the Civil War is all about slavery, right? So the whole conflict was whether or not there should be slavery. But again, you don't need to know that at this point, as long as you know that there was some conflict with the Civil War and there's some kind of group that are basically trying to reverse this outcome, right? Someone won at the end and they're trying to reverse this outcome to some extent.
Yep.
All right. And it seems to be violent, right? So it's a violent campaign.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
And this effort, which Southerners called redemption, was successful in almost every respect. All right. So I think this is potentially the statement of why Reconstruction failed is because of this redemption was effective.
Yeah, good. So it's not that Reconstruction was successful because that was obviously a failure, right? It was that they were trying to redeem themselves. They were trying to have some kind of revenge, and that was successful. That's the sabotage, right? And that sabotage is what led to the Reconstruction's failure. Okay, so Reconstruction's failure. Go ahead.
All right, next paragraph. With the defeat of the Confederacy, the federal government's enforcement of civil and voting rights was beginning to work a revolution. Ooh, all right. So the defeat of the Confederacy. So again, if you didn't know what the Civil War is, that's what happened. The Confederacy was defeated. The government's enforcement of civil and voting rights was beginning to work a revolution. So I'm not really sure what that is potentially saying other than the government is trying to change some things with civil and voting rights. Yeah.
So this is such a jump, right? We went from talking about Reconstruction and how it's a failure and how it's sabotaged to how, okay, well, this is the end of the war. This is what's happening, right? So the author's backtracking without actually telling you that they're backtracking, right? They're going back into time, it's kind of like, you ever watch a movie where you watch they kind of fast forward in the beginning of the movie to get to that point eventually in the movie.
Yeah.
Right. The best movie that comes to mind is Limitless, where he's hanging off a cliff and he's about to jump off the cliff or the building. And then it goes back to his, life afterwards. Right. And how he got to that point. That's what passages do. They'll say something and then they'll go back to an earlier time to kind of develop their point of view. Right. And you need to be able to catch on to these things. Right. So this is one way the author's doing it is by going back to the outcome of the Civil War, right? Where the Confederacy was defeated, and all of a sudden we're trying to have a revolution on ideology and enforcement of civil rights and voting. Okay, go ahead.
Hundreds of thousands of African American citizens registered to vote and eventually elected an estimated 2,000 Black officials at every level of government. All right, so kind of explaining the revolution now, which is always nice when you're like, I'm confused. And then, oh, thank you. Tell me what it is. So the voting rights led to this change in who's leading at government, because all of these African Americans were allowed to vote.
Yeah. Okay, good. So we're going back into history, learning about what happened after the Civil War. Go ahead.
The Freedmen's Bureau helped former slaves in matters ranging from land rights to education. All right, so a name of something, the Freedmen's Bureau, and what it did helped former slaves in land rights and education. Kind of a definition type thing. Is that something you would recommend highlighting? You're not a highlighter. I always forget that.
I know. Yeah. So I don't like highlighting, but you should know it.
Yeah.
Right? You should understand it. This isn't necessarily a point that they're going to ask questions about, but it is establishing the history. So if you didn't take history in high school, or, you're an international student or whatever, you don't need to take Civil War, a class on Civil War, right? They're explaining it to you right now. Maybe you don't know what Confederacy is, but as long as you know, look, the Confederacy was defeated, you're going to be fine. Go ahead.
Families divided by slavery were reunited. All right, so just kind of going through the process of post-war. Workers transitioned into a wage system, so the former slaves are now getting paid. This process was difficult but hopeful. So a long process, getting people to vote, connecting families, educating them, giving them land, giving them money.
Right. And so does this seem like the Reconstruction was actually working or not working? What do you think?
Seem like it.
Yeah, seems like it. Seems like it's working right now. I mean, you should probably not hold your breath, because they're going to probably talk about how it's going to fail or why it failed. But that's how MCAT passages work. A lot of students go in thinking, okay, I'm going to have to read a passage on 100 things, right? No, usually these passages focus on one thing and they go into detail on it, right? So don't be overwhelmed, right? You're only focused on the Civil War and Reconstruction at this point. Go ahead.
All right, next paragraph. The white South, however, was having none of it. All right, so again, if you didn't know our history, the North and the South, that's what the Civil War was, and the South did not like what was happening.
Right, and we could probably assume the South was the Confederacy, right? They're the ones that are defeated. They're not having none of it, right? They were not having none of it, which means that they don't like this stuff, right? They don't like how blacks are getting the voting rights and power and land usage and all this stuff, right? Okay, go ahead.
A broad counterattack was mounted to undo the work of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So now the student is freaking out, like, I don't know those amendments, but hopefully we don't need to know them. So it's just explaining what was happening.
Yeah, counterattack, which sounds like what?
Sabotage.
Sabotage. We're going back to the second paragraph again, right? Okay, go ahead.
This involved a campaign of murder and intimidation to disenfranchise Black Republicans and the imposition of economic systems, sharecropping, and convict labor that effectively recreated the conditions of slavery. So just kind of explaining what they were doing in those counterattacks.
Okay.
By 1875, just a decade after the war ended, white rule was reestablished in all but 3 southern states. So showing how they were successful in this sabotage.
Wow, that sucks. Okay.
Yeah. At first, Republicans such as President Ulysses S. Grant tried to help Southern blacks through armed interventions by federal troops. All right, so trying to show how even the president was trying to help prevent this sabotage. But this policy proved politically unpopular and was abandoned. So unfortunately, the president was like, I'm going to lose too many votes. Let's just not do this.
Right. Okay, so what's the big point of this paragraph?
Oh, the big point of this paragraph is just kind of highlighting what that sabotage was to potentially cause the failure of Reconstruction.
Right. And this goes with the first paragraph, which was kind of saying, look, we need to talk more about the horrors, right? So obviously the author does not like how Reconstruction was a failure and why and how it was sabotaged, right? So that is the author's point of view at this point. I mean, we can address that. We can deduce this, excuse me, because the author says this is a horror, right? This is a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, next paragraph. The reimposition of white rule was a bloody, unpunished historical crime. So this is kind of where you're getting the author's opinion, right? Of these horrors. Like, we need to be talking more about them because it was unpunished as a crime.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love when the author like lays it out that easily for us.
Yeah. But the thing is, most students give up halfway through this passage.
Oh, right? Without a doubt. Yeah.
So usually you can find the main idea in the middle of the passage or near the end. But if you're too intimidated by the first couple paragraphs, you're not going to read the rest like a normal person, right? You're going to be in your head, psyching yourself out.
Yep.
But that's why the first two paragraphs are going to be the make it or break it for most students. Because if you can get through those two paragraphs, you're going to understand a lot going into the last stages of the passage. Go ahead.
You just got to be like Dory from Finding Nemo. Just keep reading. Just keep reading. reading.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's all right. That's the new Cars motto.
Yeah.
All right. The depth of the reaction against the demands that the Negro have the right to vote, Gates argues, and the sheer range of racist vehemence and terrorism that arose to neutralize that right is stunning to contemplate. All right, so just showing this point of view that a lot of bad things happened, and it goes back to Gates's book that was talked about in the second paragraph.
All right,
that's hard. Between 1868 and 1871, an estimated 400 African Americans were lynched across the South. So, just trying to show the impact of this redemption. Sabotage.
Right, the horrors, right? Yeah, this is terrible. Okay.
About 30 were executed on a single day in Meriden, Mississippi. Wow. The killers, often roving bands of former Confederate soldiers, acted with total impunity. All right, so impunity, like total impunity. I'm like, what does that mean? And I'm going to try to guess potentially that it goes back to the unpunished crimes, right? Total impunity.
That's it. Impunity kind of sounds like immunity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it also has that punishment in there, right? Pune.
Yep.
So it means basically immune from punishment, right? You're not going to get punished. But that's exactly what you said, unpunished historical crime. So yes, exactly. You went along the same lines. You weren't sure. So you thought, okay, well, this is probably going along the same lines. And that's great reading skills. Go ahead.
By 1890, Ben Tillman, who would serve as governor of South Carolina, was crowing, "The triumph of democracy and white supremacy over mongrellism and anarchy is most complete." Wow. It's amazing that was only like a little bit more than 100 years ago.
Okay, well, what is that last quote saying here? Is it clear or is it not that clear?
I mean, to me, it's clear that the governor of South Carolina was complete sabotage. Like, hey, we're taking back over.
Yes, exactly. So you don't need to know that exactly, right? But as long as you know this is going along the lines of we're gonna do stuff we want, and that's it, right? That's kind of what it's trying to say. We're trying to reclaim our rights, right? Our supremacy, essentially. But that, you don't need to know the exact meaning of that quote, and you don't need to know who Tillman was, but at the end of the day, it's going along the lines of sabotage. It's going along the lines of how they are ruining or hurting the chances of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, and Tillman, by the way, was,
not a great guy.
Not a great guy, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so what's the big picture of this passage? What does the author really want you to know when you get to the questions?
I think the author wants us to know that there was a lot of bad stuff that happened in our history that potentially we don't talk about, which is why he says we should focus more on it. And more specifically, the conversation is around the failed Reconstruction and the sabotage that went into it.
That's it. That last half is more important than the first half, right? Yeah. Knowing the specifics on what the author's trying to say. Sabotage of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a failure. The author made that clear early on, but why was it a failure? Because it was sabotage, right? And that is the horror, right? That's the bad part.
All right, there you have it. Again, Jack Weston from jackweston.com. If you are looking for some more help in the CARS world for free, go to jackweston.com, sign up for his free daily CARS passages that get sent right to your email inbox every day. And don't forget, you can also check out his Chrome extension that he just released, his team just released, where if you are using the AAMC materials online, the QBanks and stuff, Jack and his team released a Chrome extension that will actually convert the format that the AAMC uses, which isn't the real format that you'll see on your test day, and actually converts it into a format that will help you to simulate the real test environment, which is awesome. A free Chrome extension that you can search for. Again, that's Jack Weston, jackweston.com. Have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT CARS podcast.
This is MedEd Media.